In 1917, after major military losses during World War I, the Russian army began to mutiny, an event that sparked a wave of political unrest that led to the Bolshevik seizure of power and the fall of Tsarist rule. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, just 2 years after the end of the Soviet military's misadventure in Afghanistan. Failed wars lead to regime change in Russia. This is what Western policymakers and their advisors believe based on these historical facts. So, this is the main doctrine on which the long-term Western plan to crush Russia is based. According to our research, analysis and estimates, the course of this plan can be divided into 5 phases. Western countries will supply Kiev with everything necessary to inflict the greatest possible defeat on Russia. They have already begun to do so. The last announced step was supplying Ukraine with cluster bombs and preparing to deliver F-16s to it. Perhaps this will also include sending long-range attack missiles in the near future to enable the Ukrainians to target Crimea. The Ukrainians may not be able to regain an area of territory that allows them to return to the pre-2014 borders, which means restoring all of Ukraine's territory. However, Ukraine's regaining even small parts of the territory that Russian forces stormed in 2014 will indeed be considered a major event in both Western capitals and inside Russia itself. According to the estimates of Western experts and possibly Western intelligence services as well, a decisive Ukrainian victory will inevitably lead to domestic instability in Russia. The exact form of this instability cannot be accurately predicted, but expectations range between 3 scenarios. It is a very low possibility for several reasons. The structure on which Putin built his regime, which is a highly complex structure, in which all institutions derive their survival from the survival of the leader himself, and their interests are closely linked to his interests. And even without considering this factor, the stretching of the Russian army on vast areas outside the borders of its state makes it lack the necessary capabilities to stage a military coup, even if it had the will. Also, Putin has sought to divide his men to insulate himself from insiders' threats. For example, the Russian security services are intentionally segmented into the Federal Guard Service, the National Guard, and the Federal Security Service, hindering any sort of unity and coordination necessary for a movement. In short, the West believes that moves against Putin will most likely not come directly from his inner circle. The second scenario is the outbreak of an armed rebellion inside Russia, within the iron-fisted grip of Moscow over the ethnically diverse republics of Russia. A wave of anger is growing there as these republics bear most of the brunt of the war's cost. Moscow heavily relied on fighters from these impoverished areas, including Chechnya and others. Take, for instance, one of these regions, Tiva, where a staggering statistic emerges. 1 out of every 3,300 adults has lost their life fighting in Ukraine, while the comparable figure for Moscow stands at just 1 out of every 480,000 adults. These warriors returning from the front lines after a humiliating defeat possess valuable combat experience and reasonable access to weapons. However, their return to homeland is marred by economic difficulties and the looming specter of security deterioration. This volatile mix has the potential to ignite secessionist sentiment, which may ultimately erupt into an all-out armed rebellion against the central authority in Moscow. Although the odds of this scenario unfolding are not high, they cannot be dismissed entirely. This scenario is the most preferred by Western policymakers who hope for mass protests to erupt in Russian cities led by the liberal opposition. Even though the liberal opposition's voice has been currently silenced, the West believes that a Ukrainian victory may embolden them to take action. Despite the inevitable violent repression in a country like Russia, Westerners believe that the protests, with increased Western support, could continue and eventually lead to a significant achievement. In the eyes of the West, the crux of the issue in a country like Russia lies with its leader, due to the personalized nature of its political system. Consequently, the ultimate goal in all aforementioned scenarios is to remove Putin from power. with the belief that Putin is unwilling to yield in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the potential for an enduring war looms, raising the risks of employing weapons of mass destruction and potentially plunging the world into a third world war. Thus, the West maintains that toppling Putin is the most favorable course of action, be it achieved through one of the three scenarios or a combination thereof. After the fall of Putin, the Russian elite is expected to engage in a dispute over his succession. Throughout his years in power, Putin surrounded himself with mediocrities to prevent the emergence of influential figures that could challenge his rule. While it is anticipated that Putin will be succeeded by a consensus candidate from those mediocrities who are known in Russia as technocrats, such as the Prime Minister or the Mayor of Moscow, the humiliating circumstances surrounding Putin's departure are likely to create a desire within Russia for a strongman to assume power. In such a scenario, multiple alleged Russian strongmen may rally their respective supporters, leading to a power struggle and potentially plunging the country into a state of civil war. The civil war that could ensue bears resemblance to the Sudanese scenario, as the fragmented Russian security apparatus, as previously mentioned, may engage in internal conflicts following the departure of their strong leader. Wagner's recent rebellion proves that such a scenario is not far-fetched. In the aftermath of such a civil war, chaos is expected to engulf Russia as the country is divided into spheres of influence ruled by warlords. It is expected that the West will intervene to protect the Russian nuclear arsenal from falling into the hands of armed groups through cooperation with the post-Putin government. Although it is anticipated that this government will likely be more extreme than its predecessor, it will inherit a country in a state of division and weakness that will force it to focus on internal affairs. This focus on domestic upheaval could lead to a dramatic end to the Russian war on Ukraine, with Russian forces completely and unconditionally withdrawing from the country, returning to their homeland to restore stability. Many observers believe that such a plan is merely the wishful thinking of certain anti-Russian factions within the United States and the West. On the other hand, there are those who firmly believe that it is a conclusive and irreversible plan devised by the American national security establishment, with unwavering support from Europe. Of course, it is impossible to definitively ascertain the accuracy of either viewpoint. Nonetheless, by examining the available information and extrapolating from it, we can gain insight into what might unfold in the global arena in the near future.